Welcome to Locked In, your source for college football intel. We want to give a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to our channel this month. We've had a blast talking football with you. If you enjoy this video and want to see more great content, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Even more, share our videos with your friends. Again, thanks for being locked in. This show is going to take as a central theme uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that has affected many people in college football with the rise of the transfer portal. Now, from the players' side, you could say uncertainty has been something that they've dealt with far longer than the transfer portal has existed because a coach has always had the power to up and leave. And we've seen it happen lots of times. We've seen coaches pledge that they're going to stay. I always think of Urban Meyer being on ESPN's game day before the Utah State game, saying, I'm staying with the Utes. And that ended up being the last game that he coached with them, I think. Happens all the time. And, people deal with it. Well, now that the transfer portal is in full swing, we see big changes on the player side. Perhaps no situation is so rife with uncertainty and the transfer portal than is the situation at the University of Alabama. About 2 days after Nick Saban announces his retirement, the university replaces him with ex-Washington Huskies head coach Kalen DeBoer. And we all know the kind of success that DeBoer has had throughout his career. Led the Huskies to the national title game, and this past season, plenty of good things to say about him. And we at Locked In have said lots of good things about him. But here's the deal: he is a total new kid on the block at an old money school. So there is a lot of uncertainty that is surrounding the Alabama program, whether people want to admit that or not. It's pretty obvious. And I'll start out just by saying that one of the things that Alabama has come to represent over the 17 years of Nick Saban's career there is a place that can, one, compete every year for an SEC championship, two, a place that most years will be in the national championship picture, and third, and maybe more importantly than anything, to the kids who came there, and kids who sat the bench for 2 years just get to play at Alabama for Nick Saban, the chance of enhancing their draft status to the maximum extent, it might not be there anymore. And I think that a lot of these things have come together to create like a really tenuous situation in Tuscaloosa. And that's going to be the subject of our show for you today. And we're going to kind of bounce this back and forth and talk about it from a few different angles. Most of them will involve the players who have transferred out, but we're also going to consider the recruits who are beginning to flip their commitments, not too far before the February signing day. There's lots of change going on, coaching changes, building the staff, who's familiar, who's not familiar, who's accepting offers, who's rejecting offers, and what this all is going to mean for Alabama in their first season under Kalen DeBoer. So this ought to be a pretty interesting show. So, gentlemen, who wants to start us out? Just can somebody give us the lay of the land on what the transfer situation is at the moment at Alabama?
Yeah, go ahead, Rev.
Okay, so as of right now, and this is different sites have different numbers as far as the number of transfers that they have going out. I have seen a number as big as 42, but on 24/7, on Bama's 24/7, at the current time of this recording, there are 26 transfers that are in the portal. So this isn't counting. There's a couple other things, you're talking about draft people who have an option between the draft and the portal, and there's other factors that go with that big number that we talked about, but who are solidified in the portal, whether they're currently in it or they were and they've already committed to a team. Bama 24/7 has 26. Out of that 26, a majority of them are major contributors. Either they were starters or they were going to be starters and they played significant snaps this season. There's only a few of them that aren't don't have stars on their names. They're more walk-on guys. But other than 2 on the list that I'm looking at right now, everybody is at least a 3-star, and there's only a couple 3-stars. The rest are 4 and 5 who have already committed to other places or are currently in the portal. So you talk about the amount of scholarships that each team gets a year. 24, 26, there are certain things that add and detract depending. But, in that mid 20 range scholarships every year, you're talking about an entire class number wise that Alabama is losing since Saban's announcement. There were a couple that happened before, but most all of them have occurred after the announcement that Saban was going to retire. And a lot of them are high production guys. The biggest one that everybody will probably know the name of will be Isaiah Bond. He made a name for himself this year at Alabama as being a big playmaker, and he did make some very big plays. He, of course, as most people already know, is committed to Texas. Like he's gone to Texas to be with Sarkisian and a good-looking Texas team for next year, trying to compete in the SEC. But then you have some other pretty notable names. Wardale Williams was a second-string running back for Alabama. He had 6 touchdowns, over 600 yards. He's going to FSU. And then a high production tight end who had, I think, 400 or 500 yards, multiple touchdowns, Amari Niblack. He has not committed yet. He's entered. So that's another big name that people may have seen this year. Des Ricks, cornerback, he's going to A&M. He had significant playing time this year. And we can continue down this list. There's a whole lot of them. And then notably also is the center who became a little bit infamous in the Michigan-Alabama game, Seth McLaughlin. He is going to Ohio State. And then Terrence Ferguson, who is a interior offensive lineman, he's going to FSU. So those are some bigger names. And then Malik Benson is one that I want to point out, not just because he's going to FSU and I'm a fan of them, but this past year, he had been suffering a lot of injury stuff, so he was not a factor this year for Alabama. But the previous year, he was. He was a stud, and he was looking to have a very good 2024 season. I think Alabama. I've seen some Alabama fans talk about they were really hopeful for him, as many others on this list. And instead, these guys are finding new homes. And like Locke was talking about, the instability of Alabama's situation, the uncertainty on whether this new coaching staff they're going to have is going to be able to prepare them for the NFL. All of these things, also playing time, not sure if this coaching staff is going to have the same mindset as the previous coaching staff, because as some people might not know, but just because, you seem to be a big time playmaker and have a lot of snap time or have a lot of snaps and have a lot of play time on a team one year, when that coaching staff changes, their view of the team changes, their schemes change, and all of a sudden your play style, your skill set might not fit into what the new coaching staff is wanting to do. And all of a sudden you find yourself having significant less playing time, seeing significant less snaps. So I think that's a contributing factor. And then also just past relationships. Some of these guys, they don't have good relationships with the new guys coming in just because they don't know them. And there are other schools that have, recruits or recruiters that were heavy on them in high school that are now at new places or maybe the same place. And it feels more comfortable for these guys to go to some place that they know rather than a place that they've been, but the coaching staff has changed. So it feels a little bit foreign to them. So there's a lot that goes into this process as far as transferring the whys. Obviously, money is a big one now with NIL. Some of these teams are able to drop quite a significant amount on transfers, especially big targets that fill roles on their teams. So there's so much that goes into this, but the conclusion is Alabama is suffering from the transfer portal instead of being helped by it a lot more this year than ever in the past. And you're seeing a mass exodus of high level players, good guys, whether they already had good playing time or they were going to have good playing time in the future. There's a large amount of them that are finding new homes elsewhere instead of Tuscaloosa.
So, Chance, what can you add to this about this situation in Alabama?
Well, mainly besides all the transfers, is this affects not only the ones who've already went into the portal, but the players on their roster and every player who's going to be playing college football in the future. There's multiple people on their roster who is questionable to return and transfer just because of coaching changes. And what's even worse is, as of yesterday, they had 7 people committed in their 2025 class. Alabama did. And today it has diminished down to 3, with multiple 5-star receivers decommitting, offensive linemen, defensive linemen all decommitting. So, I mean, it's not looking good right now for Alabama. And I think we really need to get in depth to look at why, and that would be the coaching changes.
So here's the thing that I find interesting about that. If we segue to the coaching change, it strikes me that there's a lot to be excited about with Kalen DeBoer coming in. One place in particular that I'm really just kind of interested in the I guess the departure of some players is the wide receiver group, because the Shepard, the wide receivers coach at Washington, is coming along with DeBoer, and their wide receivers are some of the best that I think you'll ever see. They're well trained, and so it looks like to me that that would be kind of a shoe in to stay, because I think that really the thing that Washington's coaching staff seemed to pride themselves on was development of players. So I think that would help you out, but somehow that doesn't seem like it's going to be or it's not proving to be a selling point to that's sticking with the kids at Alabama. So what do you see as the problem with the coaching changeover that's leading to the transfers and the decommitments?
Yeah, I think the big coaching problems is not the offensive side of the ball, although a lot of receivers and some running backs and linemen have decommitted. I would chalk it up to the defensive side, because after Kevin Steele retired, before Saban retired, they was already going to have to look for a DC. But with Saban there, everybody knows a DC comes and goes, and usually is very good either before they come or very good after. And there's a long list of them. 2 that include Kirby Smart and Will Muschamp. Now, if you think about that and you think, well, who is going to be their next DC? Well, they have 2 co-defensive coordinators that were hired as of today. One is Kane Womack from South Alabama. He was their head coach, and he does run a 4-2-5 defense in the base, which I think that is very similar to the Alabama defense, and players do probably tend to like that. Now, with that being said, their other co-defensive coordinator is Maurice Linguist, who is from University of Buffalo. He was their head coach. Now, with that being said, Travarius Robinson, who is now Georgia's co-DC, did have an opportunity to interview at Alabama after he had already went to Georgia. So, being at Alabama already as their safety and DB coach, he had a very good relationship with all the defensive players, especially Caleb Downs, who Alabama was looking to keep on their roster, especially since he won the Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year award and is probably one of the nation's top players, although he is a freshman, especially on defense. So with all that being said, they was worried about him leaving, and from sources I've heard, Robinson was interviewed from DeBoer for hours. They talked for a while, and he ultimately decided to stay at Georgia with his new job solely because he wouldn't get to call the defense at Washington. Or at Alabama. That's all he wanted. He wanted to call the defense at Alabama, be the DC in the role. But it was mainly just going to be a pay raise, a title change, and a good little treat to keep all the Alabama players on defense that they wanted to keep, such as Caleb Downs. So he just decided the better fit for him would be to go to Georgia with his longtime friend, probably best friend, if we're being honest, in Will Muschamp, who's also at Georgia. and he's now their co-DC in a good spot with Glenn Schumann looking to move out of that role within the next few years, if not this year, you'd have to think.
I want the offensive stuff for Alabama a little bit. Chance had a good breakdown on the defense there, but Locke posed a good question. The receivers in particular, especially Isaiah Bond, who's a big one, and Malik Benson, who is supposed to have a really good year. Everyone's looking to have a good year next year. One of the things that doesn't necessarily have to do with coaching change, but more of just change around the program and the trajectory of this offense is question marks around the quarterback position for Alabama. There have been obviously there were questions going into this year about who was going to take it, who was going to emerge as the top. Uh, you obviously had Jalen Milroe, and then you had Tyler Buckner from Notre Dame, who I think people thought would be somewhat competitive with Milroe. Milroe won the job, and now Tyler Buckner is going back to Notre Dame to play lacrosse. He's not even going back to play quarterback. But there's a lot of uncertainty. Will Jalen be the starter next year? Now, he's coming back, and I think everyone's intentions that he is going to be. I think he certainly believes it. But from a receiving standpoint, and then you have new coaches coming in, there could be a significant question mark on whether he will be the starter next year. And if Alabama is able to bring in any transfers that could compete with him or that, are pretty high on the list. As of right now, they have not. They've only gotten 3 incoming transfers, one from A&M, one from Southern Cal, and one, or actually 2 from A&M, sorry. So they don't have a quarterback right now from the portal, and they do have some young guys coming up. Maybe they're hoping that some of those young guys can compete with Milroe going into next year. But from the receiver standpoint, having uncertainty about who your quarterback is definitely changes things. It's like talk about 3 studs that I believe are all going to the draft next year for Washington. They knew who their quarterback was. They knew Penix was going into this year. He was the starter. He was declared the number 1. There was no question about it. They had already played with him for a year. He was going into the next year. Hey, we're going to stick with this guy. We're going to run it back. And they competed for a national championship. Now, all those guys are going to the draft, but you got to think that high level receivers do really care about who their quarterback is. Something that I see as a trend within the portal and within recruiting is that once teams land a good quarterback out of the portal or a good quarterback in recruiting, one of the top 10 guys, you will typically see really good receivers also then follow suit with those same teams, whether that be from the portal or from high school recruits committing to a team when that elite quarterback gets there. I think right now, FSU, just because I follow them so closely, is a good example of that. We've had a couple names from the portal this year commit to us when DJ committed to us. Now, I know there's a very large argument whether he's a good quarterback or not, but he kind of reinvented himself at Oregon State. Other than a couple games, he did have a very good year there, and he is a winner. Despite what some people say, he has won a lot of games as a starter, and I think there are a lot of receivers who like that about him. So there are a couple guys in the portal followed him, and also Luke Kermenhawk from Benedictine down in Savannah as a recruit. He signed with us. He was committed to us, and other than one guy who was already committed somewhere else and was pretty firm with Ohio State, that being Jeremiah Smith, all of our receiver targets that we went for, Florida State got them. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they had a top 5, top 3 quarterback that signed with them as well. So bringing this back to Alabama, with the future uncertainty of quarterbacks, you have receivers looking at that and saying, okay, I think I'd rather go somewhere where I know I'm going to have a great quarterback that's going to be thrown my way. So you talk about Isaiah Bond. He is a great wide receiver. He's a 5-star guy. He's, everybody knows his name at this point. He's going to Texas. Well, he knows that Ewers is still going to be the quarterback at Texas. So he knows that he's going to have a big time guy throwing to him. And that makes a difference for these guys. So, and the tight ends the same way. We don't know yet where Amari Niblack is going to go, but he was a high productive tight end for Alabama. I'm sure that the team he picks, at least I would expect him to be highly evaluating what teams, as far as his top teams that he wants to go to, he's going to be evaluating their quarterback. Do they have a guy nailed down? Do they have a guy they know is going to be their starter? Did they get a guy from the transfer portal that, is predicted to be. Those kind of things are going to matter to these offensive guys. And I think ultimately, just the question mark around Jalen Milroe in Alabama, along with what the coaching staff is coming in. Do they want Jalen Milroe? Is that the kind of guy they want running? Uh, I don't know the answers to that. So, and I think that's kind of where some of these offensive guys are. They don't know the answers to that either, and they'd rather go somewhere that they know the answer a little bit more clearly, rather than stick around and wait to find out. Because if you wait to find out and it doesn't work out in your favor, it might be too late.
Yeah, I think that that's probably what a lot of people are thinking, is that there's just a lot of really, I think, cautious, just, I guess, a lot of precaution being taken in the situation. Now, I think that if we look at it optimistically, I think that Milroe, could perform for him. Who knows what can happen, with him as a passer. We know he's a great runner, but the thing that I think is very similar between what Washington does and what Alabama has done with Milroe is, although Penix was not, he was not a run first quarterback. He used that same little QB counter to great effect, that the same one that Milroe used, all year, and used a couple of times effectively against Michigan. We saw Penix do the same thing against Texas, two, maybe three times. So they're DeBoer and staff, they're used to working with a running quarterback. And what I would be interested in seeing is can they coordinate an offense that's going to make Milroe comfortable distributing the ball with the pass? Because looking back at some of the things that we had some of the videos we had done earlier, you saw a lot of times when Milroe, like for instance, one particular play in the Rose Bowl was surrounded by 12 bodies, and instead of dumping the ball off to a hot route underneath, he runs forward and just eats the sack. Well, can you work that out? I would like to think that someone like DeBoer thinks that maybe you could, because I know that Milroe catches a lot of negative criticism, but there is an upside to him. I think that you could do something with him. How hard of a job is that? I don't know, and that's for that staff to decide. And who knows what move they might make. If there's a better option, I think that they'll definitely go that way. But there's still some hope for Milroe. Something else that I wanted to mention that we had talked before recording this show is, do you think that, like, with the tendency of the players, now there are some who have, for instance, there's one Alabama transfer who has committed to Tulane, a good team but not a powerhouse program. There was a tight end who was committed to Tennessee, who once again, good team, more prestige definitely than a Tulane, but they're not in that national championship picture, at least not just yet. I don't think they would like to think that maybe they're getting there, but they're not there yet. Um, but you see these Florida State, Texas, people of that nature. Do you think that there's some desire among these players to say that I want to go to teams that have major, not just major college football brand appeal, but teams that have a track record of placing people in the NFL? So, with that being said, do you think that this might be a moment where we see the NFL pipeline from Alabama maybe in question? I'm not going to say it's drying up, because we don't know what next year looks like. But do you think that that has something to do? Because I know we've talked about, the receivers wanting, I'd like to go someplace where there's a quarterback that can get me the ball, to help me produce. That's one phase of that. But with a person like, say, Isaiah Bond, or the tight end, I forget his name now,
Mari Black.
Nye Black. Um, do you think with people like them who have aspirations of going on, that the lure of a Florida State who has had, as you've mentioned before, has had success uh, putting transfer kids into the NFL, or Texas, who has a track record of putting people in the NFL? Do y'all think that that might be something that's weighing on their minds pretty heavily?
I definitely do. I think, in all teams, when we're talking about the portal, NFL is something that is a reason that guys transfer. Playing time to get good film, to look good, to get to the NFL has to be one of the factors for any team. But I think that is made extra when we talk about Alabama, because one of the biggest reasons to go to Alabama was Nick Saban, not just because of championships, because of his connections with the NFL and what has been clear as a pipeline. He's going to develop you to be the best version of yourself as a player, to where you're going to have the best chance of getting drafted within the first 3 rounds in the NFL. And then, even beyond that, just his connections with the NFL, even if you don't do well in the draft, you may have a good chance at signing as an undrafted free agent or later round guy that then, hey, when it comes down to roster cuts, you got two guys who are performing almost the exact same, but one guy came from UCLA and the other guy came from Alabama. They're going to go with the Alabama guy almost every time because they know where he came from, and that means something to the NFL. I think you talk about, Alabama's draft history. You get very clear that that is something that Alabama has been just known for over the years. It's, Saban's tenure there. So now we get talking about the transfers coming out there this year in particular. So when you have these guys on a team that is all about NFL future and that has a draw to be made as good NFL prospects, the people who are in the portal right now who are, they're having this question of, am I going to be developed into a great NFL draft prospect with this new coaching staff? They don't know. So these guys are trying to find a team that is going to be able to do that for them at a more certain rate than they are sitting in Alabama with just the unknowns. So FSU is a good example, especially out of the portal. We've had some very large hits on guys that maybe were not super well known before they came to FSU. Jared Verse is one that's going to be in the draft this year's projected top 10 pick. He came from Albany 2 years ago. Nobody knew his name other than college scouts who were trying to get him on their team. FSU was one of the first ones to really offer him and pick him up because they saw film of him against Syracuse. They got him. And even last year, he was going to be a first rounder. This year, he's transformed into a top 10 pick. And there are others. I mean, Jermaine Johnson from Georgia a couple of years ago was a very similar situation. We've had a couple offensive guys as well who've Keon Coleman is the one everybody knows this year. Johnny Wilson from Arizona State, Keon Coleman from Michigan State. The list does go on. Trey Benson is another one. So, I mean, there's just a lot of guys who have a history at FSU transferring in, being made better, getting put out, at a FSU, despite the hate that they receive. They do have a very large following. They are always, they're on good times on prime time in TVs. So they get a lot of eyes on them, which helps. And they produce good NFL talent. Same thing can be said of Texas. Texas has a good brand. Texas has good coaches. They produce NFL talent. So I think that you're going to be some of the things that you're going to see that these guys look for is, does this team turn me into a great NFL prospect that, I'm entering the transfer portal? Where can I go that's going to turn me into a good prospect? And then on, another aspect of it, we got to talk about is the money. Obviously, I don't, I'm not an A&M fan. As you can probably tell, if I'm an FSU fan, I don't like A&M because of who their coach was up until this last year when he got fired. But A&M is known for how much money they're able to drop on recruits and in the transfer portal. I mean, it's been said at this point, like Jimbo Fisher, all he cared about a couple of years ago was getting the number one ranked recruiting class of all time. He didn't even care about the fit. He just wanted the highest rated guys, and he used a lot of money to get that. So I don't know if I would put A&M as one of those, big time NFL producers, but they are a big time money producer. So when it comes to NIL, giving these transfers money to get there, that has to be a conversation. There's other ones. Miami is another big example of a big money school that gets guys to come in. But that playing time, eyes on, and draft stock, those are the big factors that play into this. But I think the draft stock one is a bigger conversation when you talk about Bama transfers in particular, because that's what so many people go to Bama for. And it cannot be ignored that is what these guys are looking at.
I'll agree with you there, Rev. I think if you go to Bama, you're committing to almost like a 4-year service in the military where you give away your life to go play football for 4 years. I mean, it is a training academy for the NFL. It's about the same as Georgia's turned into.
Mhm.
They're just mini NFL team. So you go there, you train, you get better, you learn things about the game of football, and you come out being a good football player that will go to an NFL team and at least be able to be on the practice squad. And that's if you're unathletic. If you are an athletic freak, which most of them are, you pair that with football knowledge and technique, and then you have your first round draft picks or your starters in the NFL, your all pros. And we've seen it countless times, especially at Alabama. And with Nick Saban gone, Kevin Steele gone, most of the offensive staff gone, most of the defensive staff gone. So there's not much certainty that, hey, these guys don't have the same connections. They don't run exactly the same stuff. They don't call the exact same stuff. They do things differently. They practice differently. They prepare differently. I'd say that most most words and signals and stuff are going to be like the universal stuff and like schemes, how like the wording for them and the learning of them. It's pretty much going to be universal, but at the same time, it's different everywhere you go. And Washington isn't the pro style top. And that's where most of the coaches come from. Said I think about 80% of the coaching staff at Alabama now is your ex Washington coaches that came with the board. And I just don't know if there's a lot of certainty for what they're going to do next year, along with how they're going to be and what they're actually going to produce when it comes to players and the look on the field.
I do want to add a little bit of a aside, just kind of talking about the transfer situation right now, and credit to a lot of Alabama fans who I'm sure are a little bit upset at this, the topic about how they're getting feasted upon in the portal, because that is something that they're kind of been used to over the last couple of years. Just like Georgia, the top schools, they don't have a lot of holes to fill because they are a top school for a reason. Alabama's been there, Georgia's been there, and Ohio State as well. But these guys, that they're not having to bring 20 transfers in every year because they have those positions, they have the depth, they're good. They already are good. And then they'll just bring a couple pieces they think that can make them better. Alabama's been on that list. So, like, if you go back the last few years, they've had way more transfers out than they've had come in. And that's typical for great teams. But they have some significant names that everyone at this point who's paid attention to college football, they know over the last couple of years. Jamison Williams and Henry To'o, those were two very large transfers coming in 2021. They had 4 come in, they lost 10, but 2 of the 4 were massive contributors to their team. Same thing. You get the next year, you get Jermaine Burton, Eli Ricks, and Jameer Gibbs, 3 very big names for Alabama, who've made very big impacts on their team. And they lost 23 transfers. They only got 5 that year. So again, we're talking about right now the portal situation. 24/7 has 26 listed for Alabama this year, and they only have 3 right now coming in. But I think the difference here is they don't have a really big target that's a big name. Like I'm 20 in 2022, he might have just been at Georgia Tech. Jameer Gibbs was an absolute stud, and nobody would argue that. Everybody who watched Georgia Tech play that year, they were incredible, or he was incredible, not they, but he was incredible. So right now, and it's still early, but you look at the transfer list and they just haven't hit on a big target yet, but they have big targets who are leaving. They have big names who are leaving them. I think that's the difference between this year and the past. So I just want to talk about that because I'm sure we're going to have some Bama fans, say, well, this happens to us every year. Yes, but this time it looks a little bit different. The caliber of player that you're losing, it's not just some young guys that don't want to wait on their playing time or that just aren't fitting quite the way they thought. It's guys who were projected to be starters next year, or they already were starters, and they are now leaving. That is a little bit atypical for Alabama. And that's kind of what's spurring this conversation on is the different level of leaving that we see right now, which coincides with the coaching conversation. And I also want to say that there are a lot of Washington guys on the staff, but the staff has not been made complete yet. There's still a lot of holes on the staff, at least outside knowledge. There are still positions that have not been filled. One of the things, not only are they from Washington, but there is a large contingent of Indiana coaches from the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, when DeBoer was in Indiana in 2019 as their OC. There are a lot of guys from that team that have now found themselves at Alabama. Some of them have already been there, like their strength and conditioning coach. He was in Indiana, then he went to Alabama before DeBoer. He's staying because now DeBoer is there. So that is a big win for Bama. He's a good strength and conditioning coach. The players know him well, and typically speaking, teams love their strength and conditioning coaches and they're very close with them. So him staying is going to really help. Might be a solid rock as far as the coaching staff goes, in that program. But there still are some holes on staff that we're very curious to see how they get filled, and who they get filled by, where they're from. One of the things that we haven't quite mentioned yet is the ability of this coaching staff recruiting in the South. And can they do it? Do they have the staff that can compete with Georgia every year? Do they have the staff that can compete with Auburn in house? Because I mean, despite Auburn's woes on the field and going 6-6, Auburn has a very good recruiting class, and Hugh Freeze, despite his shortcomings, he's a good recruiter. So, can they win against their in-state rival? Can they win against out-of-state powerhouses? Florida State's not that far away from Tuscaloosa, and we target a lot of the same guys. Can they win against Norvell, who's had a history already recruiting against Alabama, Georgia, Florida, LSU, big time names? And I think that's another question mark that, you got to look at. Does this coaching staff have what it takes to compete with the big dogs down south? And if they don't yet, can they get somebody or get a couple names onto their staff that remain, that keep them as big time recruit threats in the South? Or do you see the staff look a little bit elsewhere? Do they go further toward the Midwest, up north and out west to find guys? I would think not, but you don't know. So like, all of these things are still contributing to all we're talking about, of just a lot of unknowns and uncertainty, like we opened with, around the Alabama program.
Yeah, and I think that the decommits from the 2025 recruiting class gives a lot of validity to everything that we're saying, because it's not only the players that are there, it's the players that wanted to be there with the old coaching staff and now have no intention to be there.
Yeah, and one of the things too, I mean, I want to say, because I think with a subject like this, um, it trends toward doom, and that, I don't think that's really what we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And when I guess a lot of it's a matter of perception, because that's the thing I think's funny, like in just looking at comments that people will make. For example, people, like, we were in love with the Washington offense and down on the Michigan defense. And, if you heard that in anything we said, then, God help you. Same thing here. I don't want somebody to twist and say, well, y'all are, totally against Alabama. We're totally indifferent to Alabama. We're just talking about things that we see happening, questions that we want to ask, in relation to things we see happening. Is DeBoer getting a fair shake? Who knows? But there's a there, and and like for instance, excuse me, one of the subjects we talked about earlier this evening was the new hire at the defensive coordinator spot. Who is what's his first name? Womack, I forget. I'm terrible with names.
Kane.
Kane Womack. So Womack comes from being the head coach at South Alabama. Um, the jump to Alabama from South Alabama sounds like it would be enormous, but if you look at his history, this guy he's a really good defensive coach, and he is another one of the Indiana people from back in those 18, 19, 20 years when Indiana had some pretty strong teams. And if you'll remember, which I mean, I recall as a Tennessee person, Indiana came a snipe and beating Tennessee in the bowl game that year. They were a very impressive team. Now, the argument can be made, which I mean, to add also to that, South Alabama, was ranked the number 15 total defense team in the NCAA this year. That's impressive. And you don't get there, without having the ability to coach up the kids and, and get them where they need to be. With that being said, though, maybe he has the goods. Maybe this is going to work out. But I think when you look at it on paper, you go right back into the same spot that we're at with everything else, is that even though Kane Womack has produced greatly everywhere he's been, the question is still there. And I think some will say, well, that's really unfair, because you always hear that about, talk about the SEC, but he is going to the SEC. And this is going to be different. It is going to be tough. And that's not to say, like we all three, had no reservations picking Michigan over Alabama. So we're not the kinds who will say, oh, SEC is, is this, great dominant force. We're not going to say that. We're going to tell you the truth about what we see. And in that instance, we thought there's no way, Michigan will win this game. I mean, they have to come out on top. They're the better team. They're the more complete team. Didn't make a difference what conference they were from. So we, on the one hand, will say that, but then on the other hand, we will say, I will say, to use the old Mark Twain quote, that the difference between South Alabama and Alabama in college football is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. There's a big difference there. And I think that, that's another thing that you're going to have to prove to people before they buy in completely into what you're selling. And I mean, do y'all disagree? I mean, obviously Womack he's had a good career. And I think that he's probably well deserving of a big time job, to see what he's got on that stage. But, just because you're deserving of it, just because you've had the track record, that doesn't mean that people are going to believe you from day one whenever you take that big job. What do y'all think?
Yeah, I think the fan base is definitely skeptical, but I also think that it can be seen that the players and the future players are definitely skeptical about what's happening in Alabama.
Yeah, talking specifically from the coaching aspect of it, where he's, Womack in particular, where he's coming from, where he's going to be at now, and just the kind of new monster that he's walking into. I think about in the past, smaller level coaches going to bigger schools, and some succeed and some do not. And the difference between the stakes, the expectations, the level, the busyness, the speed, especially when you're talking about on-field stuff, you know, we always we always say there's a difference between high school speed to college speed, and the difference between college speed to NFL speed. Well, there's also a difference between the speed of all the guys on the field at South Alabama versus all the guys at the field at Alabama. And we don't just mean 40 times. We're talking about game speed, head speed, sight. What are they looking at? Where are they looking? How quick are they making decisions? Those kind of things change dramatically when you look at lower level play, lower level conferences versus high level conferences. And in this case, who has history wise, I don't mean this year or overall, but just, the last decade has been the more dominant conference, at least their top teams have. And Alabama is one of the top teams, the SEC versus the Sun Belt. Now, I mean, I know the Sun Belt had a great year this year, and I think in the bowl season they were fantastic. But the point remains: Sun Belt is not the SEC. South Alabama is not Alabama. And just to pull from what I followed super close, and people are gonna get tired of me talking about FSU stuff, but I think about Willie Taggart. He was a head coach at South Florida. He had a 1 year at Oregon, or two, and then he went to FSU after Jimbo left us. And I had all, I didn't know about him. I was skeptic, but I hoped that he was going to do well. He produced a good recruiting class at Oregon. They had an okay year. And I was hoping that he would be able to translate at FSU. But the one thing that I remember telling my dad all those years ago when we hired him was, I don't know if he can do that at FSU. FSU is different than South Florida, and it's different than Oregon. I mean, I know Oregon has great recruiting classes and there's a great history there, but between the two of them, FSU is the better school and the better job. Now, right now, I know that Dan Lanning's doing something great in Oregon, but history-wise, that is just the case. Argue with a wall. And when it came to recruiting, especially, and then also just organizational, Willie Taggart was just not able to withstand the pressure, the expectation, and the level that FSU was compared to where he had been before. And that was something that I remember just watching the games. It was the most unorganized, most chaotic, just poorly run team that I had seen on TV in a long time. And it was my team. So that made it even worse. But I'm watching a guy who was just inept at being able to manage from the head coaching position. And he called a lot of the offense. He couldn't do it. He couldn't cut it at FSU. It was too big for him. So obviously we're not talking about head coach, but from a guy who was a head coach and it was very instrumental in the defense, recruiting all the things at South Alabama. He did great there. 2022, he was 10-3, a 10-2 regular season. They won their conference. They were good. So he's a good coach. And as we talked about, his defenses are very good. But now you're at a new animal. And that question now comes up. Can you handle the speed of it? Can you handle the enormity of being Alabama's defensive coordinator? I don't know who's going to be calling the plays for their defense, who's going to be signaling in and, really being the drafter of their scheme and their plans, but he's a co-DC or a DC, whatever. He is going to be instrumental in this defense one way or the other. And can somebody from a lower level like that jump directly into the deep end and just hit it and go and have success? Maybe, but I think we're being skeptical for a reason. And, as we talked about, we're not biased against Alabama. Maybe Chance is a little bit because he's a Georgia guy. But, I mean, I actually kind of like Alabama. My great-granddad was a massive Bama fan. He died 2 years after Saban got hired, so we kind of got to see them get better from year one to year two. And that kind of made me like Alabama and follow them. But obviously, my allegiances lie elsewhere than Alabama. We're bringing conversation up about a team that has been so dominant for so many years. But these are legitimate questions. We're not trying, as Locke said, we're not trying to put the team down. We're not trying to put DeBoer down. We have a lot of hopes for DeBoer, as we've talked about before. We really like him, but these are real things that need to be brought up or need to be talked about because we're seeing it unfold in front of us. As Chance said, recruits and current players are skeptical. We also should be skeptical, and when it comes down to it, we'll see how this thing plays out over the course of the offseason. But the biggest teller will be what happens on the field in 2024. Can this staff bring it all together and compete in the SEC in their first year there? Or is it, is it not as good as it has been? Does it look a little bit worse? Does it look like it, it might be a little bit too big for their britches here? So, there's a lot of what ifs, a lot of conjecture, but these are all things that do need to be thought about because this is a whole new situation that Alabama hasn't had to deal with for 16 years.
Yeah, and I think that the thing of it is too. I hope that I've been impressed because I can't say that I've kept up with DeBoer. I haven't. I mean, he was I've known of him at Washington for the past 2 years. Learned a lot more about him this year. But the thing that I hope is that he's given some grace, and he's given some time and opportunities to work things out. Because when Nick Saban came in, he came into Alabama when it was at a distinctly different position than where it is now, and you hear, or at least it seems that I hear almost every time that the DeBoer hire is brought up, people will mention, oh, it's never, the second guy, after the great, who can make it work. And maybe that's true in some circumstances, but, I don't think that that's a reason to be unduly skeptical. But I think that a lot of the things that we're saying, and I know we're probably, we're hammering this point a lot, is that there is reason to be a little doubtful. And I think that it could be it probably is a stressful situation for the Alabama team, for their staff, for their fan base. It's got to be tough because this is some unfamiliar territory. I mean, they've been very stable for quite a while now. It's a long time, since they lost to Louisiana Monroe back then when in Saban's first year. So it's going to be quite different. But the thing too that I think that you've got to definitely mention is that this is interesting to people outside of the Alabama fan base because we very seldom get to see a, I guess, such a such a powerhouse on shifty ground. And I think that people, regardless of of what you say about the situation, I think everybody's going to be interested to see how it works out. So there are going to be a lot of eyes on Alabama for better or for worse. And I mean, I for one am interested in seeing how it goes, and I hope them all the best. And I really hope that DeBoer has a good run down there. And so then maybe that sounds odd because I guess I always identify first, as a Tennessee guy because of affiliation. But I do hope he has success. I think he's a great coach, and I've enjoyed watching what he's done at Washington. But I also have to say that, like maybe in a twisted sense, I think it's really interesting to see what's going to happen now that we have the what's been considered like the greatest program kind of on skates a little bit. It's going to be very interesting to see how they make this transition. So I mean, I for one, I'm hopeful for them. I don't wish any ill toward them, but I'm very interested to see what happens.
I think that while Alabama will always, in my opinion, be a powerhouse and dominant football team, I think that you could see some changes in the next few years, and maybe even a a down year, I guess you'd call it, for this year at least. Because I mean, their proximity to talent is second to none, and their funding is also second to none. And you also have the alumni, which is second to none, who is very generous and around the program a lot. And you still have Nick Saban in the building. So I mean, there's a lot of good things to point out about Alabama still. Maybe Kalen DeBoer isn't the guy. Maybe he is. Whether he is or not, they'll eventually find another. They've had Bear Bryant. They had Nick Saban. They'll find someone else after that. If it's not DeBoer, someone else. They have the means. They have the talent. They have the money. Alabama will always be good. They will always be winners. Might have some ups and downs, but eventually they'll get to the peak again. It's just when. So with that being said, for all of us here, stay locked in.
Everyone here at Locked In wants to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed to, liked, and commented on our channel. We've had a blast bringing great college football analysis to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit the subscribe button. If you want to share your thoughts, we'd love to see your comments. Till next time, stay locked in.